Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your Friday afternoon, morning, and evening host, Ethan, back here again talking some fantasy sports, daily fantasy sports, dynasty leagues, you know, the whole 9 yards. We're talking it all, and we're going to get right into some really, really nitty-gritty stuff here. So your boy Ethan did some research the other day, because I had this really, really interesting thought about what to do with this rookie wide receiver class that would be, one, interesting for you guys to listen to, and also something that would make my brain churn a little bit, make me think outside of the box. How do I bring interesting content while also making things a little bit more relevant in a dynasty comparative to a standard traditional one season, one league, or a keeper league, or even daily fantasy? What can I do to make things reasonably comparable between the two for rookies? Because sometimes people have to look at rookies in a different way. So, for example, rookies in a dynasty league are looked at totally differently than they are in one season. We get the draft done and we play out the season and wait and see. Of course, we know how the daily fantasy structure works, where you draft basically a team in a money pool and they play for that day or maybe even that weekend, depending on which games you play. FanDuel, DraftKings, doesn't really matter. They follow the same sort of structure. So what do you do when you think that you have a wide receiver that is a rookie that is going to be banger, that's going to be awesome for you, and you want him for a long time in the dynasty league, and you also see that he has a rookie quarterback? Well, you never know how rookie quarterbacks will pan out, just as much you don't know how wide receivers might pan out. But I promise you, rookie quarterbacks are so much harder to evaluate. And you never know, due to situation, offensive line, coaching staff. It's harder to coach a quarterback to an NFL system than it is to coach a wide receiver. So what I did was look at all of the last 10 years. When have we gotten a wide receiver that was a rookie and a quarterback that was a rookie in the same year, same draft, same team? And how did they perform? And maybe there might be a correlation between a quarterback that gets to grow with a rookie wide receiver and vice versa. And what does that mean for fantasy draft implications depending on the draft style that you are playing in, or the draft type? So, out of the pool of players I had, there was only so many that I could really choose that made sense. So I took the best names out of there, because a lot of these guys weren't in the league for very long, maybe maximum 4 years, that if they weren't really good and they weren't getting a lot of stats. So I had to make do with basically what I had here. So don't kill me. I did my best. But on this list, we have quite a bit of interesting names here. So let me zoom in really quickly so I can see properly. And who do we have here? We have Marquise Goodwin, A.J. Green, T.Y. Hilton, Marquise Lee, Demarius Thomas, Robert Woods, Antonio Callaway, Andy Isabella, Terry McLaurin, Allen Robinson, Darius Slayton. So, here we go. We got a few of these guys. The earliest we found was Demarius Thomas. Eric Decker would have been on his list, but he really just didn't get enough. Now, in 2010, we know that was the Tebow draft, and Tebow didn't do too much in his own right, and Demarius Thomas didn't really start to explode on the scene really till 2 years, really 3 years down the line. But he had 27 or 22 receptions, and he had 283 yards total on the year, but he had 2 receiving touchdowns. And then when we move over to A.J. Green in 2011, of course, he came in with Andy Dalton. A.J. Green was living the good life. I think he was targeted about 80-something times. He received the ball 65 times, had 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. So that's a good positive right there, because both of them made the Pro Bowl, A.J. Green and also Andy Dalton. They both made the Pro Bowl their rookie seasons. Good vibes. He played 15 games. Good sign right there. Next on this chronological order was T.Y. Hilton, who came in with who? The crowd says Andrew Luck. Wow. Good quarterback right there, Andrew Luck. Unfortunate retirement early in his career. But T.Y. is still kicking the tires around and playing some good football. So as long as he's not injured, of course. He got around 50 receptions that year and 861 yards with 7 touchdowns to boot. T.Y. and Andrew Luck had some really, really good connections that I am going to miss seeing on a more consistent basis personally. But moving forward, we have to take a trip down to 2013 where we have 2 people on the same team. In 2013, Marquise Goodwin and Robert Woods had to go play with E.J. Manuel, I believe, and that was just a recipe for disaster for many, many different reasons for the Bills. But alas, Marquise Goodwin didn't have that much going on for him. He played 12 games, only had 17 receptions for 283 yards. 3 touchdowns, though, so that's pretty nice. And Robert Woods on the same team had 40 receptions for 587 yards and 3 touchdowns as well. He had quite a bigger target share, and that may have to do with the fact that he played 2 more games than Marquise Goodwin. And let's not forget, E.J. Manuel only played 10 games that season, his rookie year, and someone else had to come in. And honestly, after those 10 games, Robert Woods really did burst, quote unquote, on the scene as a player, and he had way more touches going on for him in the first place. Next, we're going to continue on this list. We kind of we get to 2014, right? That's Allen Robinson, and he came in with who? Drum roll, please. Blake Bortles. So Blake Bortles in 2014, 548 yards receiving, 48 receptions, 2 touchdowns. Pretty decent rookie year. Didn't crack over 600 yards. So you got to think that means that they, coming into what we see how elite wide receivers end up turning out, we can typically tell when someone is going to be elite when they reach a certain threshold of targets, receptions, and yards. Touchdowns are kind of fluctuating, but if you can get to about 700 something yards within your first season and you can get to 50 receptions, you're looking quite good. Allen Robinson has had some injuries in his time. Of course, he hasn't played with the best quarterbacks really at all in his career at any point. So he's been going through it, but hopefully one day he'll find better value at the quarterback position for his own personal gain. But moving forward, we skip a bunch of years, right? We moved from 2014 basically to 2018. We have Antonio Callaway, and of course he came in with no better man than the Cleveland man himself in Baker Mayfield. So he had a nice little season. He had played a full 16 games, and he had 43 receptions for 586 yards and 5 touchdowns. That's pretty good. He had a 71-yard burner. I think I remember watching that live too. And his season rounded out pretty well. He played all 16 games. I don't know what his future lies, but I think he's been on people's radar as somebody who may potentially end up coming into his own at some point in his career. Now we have 3 left, all coming from, of course, last year's draft, in Terry McLaurin, Andy Isabella, and Darius Slayton. Now, Andy and Isabella, of course, came in with rookie standout Mr. Kyler Murray, and he had 9 receptions for 189 yards and a touchdown. Not that many catches. He played 15 games. Of course, that means he didn't really start too much, and to boot, he had an 88-yard reception. That was his longest, of course, so that means that took up almost half of his yardage, or half of his yardage was taken there. Terry McLaurin, 14 games, almost 60 receptions for 919 yards, 7 touchdowns, different quarterbacks, but of course, he did ended up playing for a long stint of time with a rookie QB in Dwayne Haskins. And he grew a lot, and he really had a nice young season in Terry McLaurin's name. 15.8 yards per reception. That's really, really good, especially considering the yards he got per reception ratio. And then we moved to Darius Slayton, of course, who was playing alongside Daniel Jones. Rookie, he played 14 games, same as Terry McLaurin. 740 yards, 8 touchdowns, 15.4 receiving yards, or yards per reception. So those are the people that really stand out in the last 10 years that have come in as a rookie with a rookie quarterback playing alongside them. And some have seen success. Some have seen some really good success. Some have seen less than. So what does this mean potentially? Well, if you are going into the standard league where you draft for a season and then you restart afterwards, you shouldn't put too much stock value in the idea of a rookie quarterback and a rookie wide receiver are going to automatically have good chemistry, and thus they are going to play in sync, have really good stats, and they're going to feed into one another. So I would highly advise don't draft the duo of the rookie quarterback and the rookie wide receiver in that instance for sure. It's too risky. If you're going to draft a rookie wide receiver, make sure you draft one in an offense that can really be helpful to the wide receiver. So it will play well to look at guys like Justin Jefferson, who is basically replacing Stephon Diggs in his role, and I think he will have an immediate impact there. I would look at other guys, of course. The Alabama wide receiver crew was really, really nice, and of course, we don't know what CeeDee Lamb is going to be on the Cowboys just because of where he is in the depth chart. We don't know where he's going to be. There's a lot of people that demand the ball on the Dallas Cowboys offense. It's the same thing with looking at guys like KJ Hamler and Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton on the Broncos, right? There's just so many people that will look for the ball. Don't forget Melvin Gordon. So many people are going to look for the ball, right? We don't know who's going to get it. And Drew Lock is still kind of a question mark, right? So we don't know. But there are some rookie wide receivers that may be like, let me look that way, right? So I'm going to say it here one more time, right? I'm going to say it here one more time. Let's see if you remember from the Colts who I'm going to bring up. Do you remember? Okay, time's up. It is Michael Pittman Jr. He's in a prime position now. Of course, there's a lot of question marks on who is going to get touches on the Colts running back wise, but it is without a doubt that I feel like you can trust the idea that old man version of Phillip Rivers is going to find some nice graces with newly drafted Michael Pittman Jr. He's tall, he's big, reminds him of Vincent Jackson way back in the day, throwback wide receiver Vincent Jackson. And I can just see him getting some stats that look similar to a Darius Slayton. I can see him even getting closer to stats of rookie T.Y. Hilton. He could even propel himself to A.J. Green status. The potential is limitless. However, we don't know for sure. But to end off the segment here, before we go to our first break, here we go. Dynasty leagues. It may be more favorable to do the duo combo of a quarterback, wide receiver, if you really believe in their ability. So like a Joe Burrow and like a T. Higgins, if you feel that combo is great and you want that for a long time, dynasty league it. Stay away from the combo standard leagues. Only do it in daily fantasy if they're hot and you can depend on it. There you go. All right. Well, that was my little research that I did, and I thought it was pretty cool to talk about and look at some correlations if they had any. But we're going to take our first break, and coming out, we have to talk about something that is raining down terror on fantasy football this season, and that's opting out. This is the GSMC.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on this Friday. And you know what the rules are here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, and it's hosted by me. I don't know about everybody else, but here are my rules that I try to follow and remind people about when we talk about our favorite digital game that involves real players playing a real sport. When we are doing our couch GMing here, what is rule number 1? Are you with me? Rule number 1, are you listening? Rule number 1, of course, is to always be in tune with what's going on in the National Football League at all times. And this doesn't mean that you're sitting here, phone in hand, laptop in lap, and I don't know, watching NFL Network on rewind and on a 24/7 news cycle. You don't have to do that. But of course, if you have a phone, that's just enough. You get notifications, maybe check social media, follow their social media pages, see what's going on in the national football space, especially in the off season, because you never know what is going to pop up on your feed that you may have not realized that was necessary for you to know. Because if you have been under a rock for the past, 72 hours, you may have not noticed that the NFL and the NFL Players Association have reached a way in order to continue the season onward. But in those agreements, the NFL has agreed with the NFLPA to allow certain things certain things were allowed in order for players to reach an agreement to come back and play football this season. And one of those things was being able to opt out. And you can opt out for whatever reason per se, right? Most times it's going to be for COVID-19. If people feel like they don't feel safe or they're not medically able to play. Some people have pre-existing conditions. Some people have children coming, or some people's children have already came and they want to stay and protect their family that way. And those who opt out are allowed partial compensation, so they won't be completely without money. And of course, there's also a clause if the season does not even begin, there will be compensation for players as well. But we have to talk about this opt-out thing, because when it first was announced, a lot of people speculated that there wouldn't be that many players opting out, at least in the general consensus. But more and more, we're starting to see some players rise up on lists about opting out. So that the first NFL player to opt out of his 2020 contract doubles as a medical doctor is probably telling. And that was Chiefs guard Laurent Duvernay Tardif, I believe his name's pronounced. If it's not, I apologize. I tried my best. And he says being at the front lines during his offseason has given him a different perspective on this pandemic and the stress that it puts on individuals and our healthcare system as a nation. So he cannot allow himself to potentially transmit the virus to our communities simply to play a sport that he loves. And if he is going to take risk, he says that he will do it for caring for patients. So the NFL season opt-out rules are simple. Anybody is free to decide to not play in 2020. And per multiple reports, the contracts for all players who opt out will toll to 2021. And players who opt out in 2020 will receive salary advances. Those who opt out for medical reasons because they are at high risk regarding COVID-19 will receive $350,000 for the season, and those who opt out voluntarily will receive $150,000 for the season. Undrafted rookies who opt out voluntarily are not eligible to receive the $150,000 stipend. So he was the first, of course, and there have been plenty more who have come out. So July 28th marked the last training camp reporting date for all veteran players, and the camps this year will feature a longer than normal acclimation period before fully padded practices begin August 17th. The 2020 NFL preseason, of course, was canceled, but that regular season is still scheduled to begin Thursday, September 10th, when the Chiefs are supposed to host the Texans. NFL players have reportedly have until August 4th, or 7 days after the CBA side letter on the matter is finalized, to decide whether to opt out of the 2020 season and earn the stipend contract tolling. And before it is complete team by team list of players who have decided to do just of that. So for the Baltimore Ravens, Andre Smith, who's the offensive tackle, and DeAnthony Thomas, who is a wide receiver running back. We know who DeAnthony Thomas is, one of the more infamous players of the early 2000s on those Oregon Duck squads. Speed kills. Buffalo Bills star Lou Talele, defensive tackle, opting out. Jordan Mack from the Carolina Panthers, linebacker, opting out. Eddie Goldman, defensive tackle from Chicago Bears, he's opted out. Dallas has two players as opt-outs, Stephen Goodry, wide receiver, and Maurice Kennedy, wide or cornerback. Denver had a defensive tackle, Kyle Pico, opted out. Green Bay, Devin Funchess, wide receiver, opted out. Houston Texans, defensive tackle Eddie Vanderdoes, opted out. Kansas City Chiefs, of course, we talked about it. Their guard opted out. He was the first one to opt out. Minnesota had Michael Pierce, defensive tackle, opt out. New England has the most by far who has opted out. Patrick Chung, Donta Hightower, Brandon Bolden, Marquise Cannon are Marcus Cannon, Danny Viatal, and Najee Turan. All of those players, all 6, have opted out thus far. There may be more on the way. New Orleans Saints, Cole Wick, tight end, opted out. Jason Vanderland, tight end, opted out. Thank goodness that they have a bunch of quarterbacks that can play tight end, apparently. Maybe they saw the future. New York Jets, Leo Kolomatainge. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Matangi? Kolo Matangi. There we go. Offensive lineman opt out. Philadelphia Eagles, Marquise Goodwin, who we just spoke about in the first segment, opting out. Seattle's Chance Warmack is a guard, opt out. Tennessee, Anthony McKinney, offensive lineman, has opted out. The Washington football team, Caleb Brantley, a defensive lineman, has opted out. And Larry Walford, who is still a free agent, who was cut by the Saints not too long ago, has opted out of this season as well. So far, that's who we have on this list who have decided to leave this season behind for basically a little bit. Also, we have not mentioned the biggest one that dropped recently because this list is a little bit not up to date. But Chiefs Damian Williams opted out of the 2020 season. So Super Bowl almost MVP Damian Williams has opted out. And why is this so imperative? Why are we bringing this up in fantasy football? Why does this matter? Well, let me tell you. You got to pay attention to this sort of stuff because imagine you're in a dynasty league setting. You didn't get Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And now you are basically having a panic attack because somehow you had Damian Williams on your dynasty league. And if the season happens, you don't have that player anymore. And you may not have the running back depth that you thought you would need to push through. And it's not even the fact that someone is hurt, is that it's an opt-out. And I don't know if you can put him on injury reserve. I don't know what you do with that player. We've never been in a situation like this, to be honest. So looking at this situation from fantasy perspective is very, very interesting. It's scary. If you're in deep leagues that have full-on rosters and are doing really meticulous drafting and pre-planning and, years of team building in the making, this little blip in the system, in the matrix, is probably stressing you out. It would be stressing me out. I don't have a dynasty league. I don't have a keeper league currently, so I'm in the clear. Let me remind you people, I am in the clear right now. And I was trying to plan to do a dynasty league this upcoming year. So I think it's safe to say that plan is out of the water for now, just because we need to see where we are when we come out of this on the other side. And if I'm playing as daily fantasy, I might do a seasonal draft at the most. But we're definitely going to play some daily fantasy, but dynasty, keeper leagues may have to put on ice for a little while. And it just goes to show you that you really don't know who is going to opt out. I think Damian Williams is probably the biggest name. If not, he's definitely one of the biggest names to choose to not play this season. I guess the Patriots as a whole unit is probably a bigger story, but for fantasy owners, it just has to be this. Damian Williams is the biggest story to come out of this for sure. No other really impactful offensive player has chosen to really sit out the season yet, besides Marquise Goodwin, who, if that was a guy that you were really depending on, hopefully you drafted well, I guess. Hopefully you drafted some other guys or you found somebody to be able to help you out. But other than that, everything's been really defensive-minded players, defensive tackles, offensive linemen. And not to say those are important pieces to real teams, but the fantasy, it's not that big of a drop-off for them. And looking at it from a season perspective as far as the NFL, The NFL is very much a next man up league, and depending on, as long as it's not at a pivotal position like quarterback, maybe, pass rusher, so defensive end, edge rusher, you're not dead in the water, right? They're going to find the next man up. And even then, at quarterback, they'll just suit somebody up that can tread the water until somebody else finds another way. So you saw what happened with the Lions, man. They put out a whole bunch of guys. You saw what happened with the Steelers last year. They put out a whole bunch of guys. NFL is a next man up league. It's not like if LeBron got hurt, the Lakers are done, right? Because there's a next man up mentality in NFL where the base, especially if you've done well in drafting and personnel and personal development within your own staff and with your own team, you've created a culture to where you can put somebody in and their floor is high enough to where you aren't going to crash down and burn, but their ceiling is not nearly as high as the player that that they have replaced temporarily, of course. And then in the NBA, that is not the case. If somebody is a star player in the NBA, it is apparent how much above their replacement they are in the depth chart, from stat line, plus minus, all those sort of advanced statistics. The NFL, of course, they have some of those statistics, and they have people who do have a kind of a plus minus, a wins above replacement or wins above average or anything like that. They do have variables to look at to where, oh man, this guy is really important to this team. But most times you can see that on the field anyway, and the eye test does quite enough to know how much someone is. And it gets really tricky when you're looking at linemen, because most people aren't paying attention to how linemen protect or move or how much pressure they cause their defensive linemen or things like that. The war in the trenches can get really, really clouded. And if you're not ISOing your vision on that and you're not studying them specifically, it can kind of get lost in translation. And most times the average NFL fan, football fan, is not going to be a offensive line aficionado or a defensive line aficionado. You're going to be like, oh wow, cool sack. Or, oh wow, that pass protection scheme looked kind of cool, clean pocket. Did the throw get there? Where's the wide receiver at? Running back? Woo, that's basically how it goes. But this is just a friendly reminder. Make sure you're paying attention what's happening in the NFL. Rest in peace, Damian Williams, for fantasy season 2020. We're going to take another break here, and then we're going to get into one of our two breakdowns for the AFC/NFC as far as team offensive capabilities for fantasy. This is the GSMC.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and we're back here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. And before we were talking about why you should be 100% paying attention to the NFL at all times, but not really at all times, but as much as you can when it comes to fantasy football news and different standout things going on in the NFL and even in college football. Sometimes you can get a little bit sneak preview of some guys that might be sneaking in your way on your fantasy football draft boards. And also we talked about what is it about rookie quarterbacks and rookie wide receivers being a duo that is so mesmerizing to us, and why we shouldn't probably look at them as a free ticket of points. It's not free real estate over there on that side of the fantasy streets. Now we're getting into what we started last week, which was we analyzed one NFC team, one AFC team, as far as their fantasy football projections, potential previews, things like that, and see how we feel about their players offensively going forward and what they can bring to us and what they have in store for us eventually in this NFL 2020 fantasy football season. And we are going to do their first team, the NFC standout, almost decade-long stint at being above average to great to elite to above average again, the Packers. We're talking about the Green Bay Packers. So Aaron Rodgers is going to be the central talking point about the Green Bay Packers. I know, surprising. Woo. Who would have thought we wouldn't be talking about Aaron Rodgers in a Green Bay Packers conversation? Well, the thing is, Aaron Rodgers didn't really bounce back as well as we hoped in 2019. And though given how little the Packers continue to invest in the passing game, it's hard to blame him too much. But unfortunately, the Packers essentially made no investments in the passing game yet again in the 2020 offseason. So it might be hard for things to get much better. And plus, all of a sudden, we've got a crowded backfield of the sort. And Devontae Adams isn't enough to make Aaron Rodgers an elite fantasy option anymore, and especially if the Packers remain as a run heavy as they were, which seems very likely. So the general reaction at first was a surprise, like many people. Not going to say I was thrilled by the pick. He is not to blame at all. This is Aaron Rodgers talking about Jordan Love, who was the first round selection of the 2020 NFL draft for the Green Bay Packers. We all remember draft night. We all remember what happened. Everybody was outraged. Everybody was like, why would they do this to Aaron Rodgers? It's literally like Favre and Rodgers all over again. It's a cycle. It keeps happening. Well, here, let's go take it back before then. They had a record of 13-3. They were second overall in the NFC. Behind the 49ers. They had 23.5 points per game, which was 15th in the league. They were 18th in yardage with 345.5 points per game. Pass yards per game, they were 17th. Rushing yards were 15th. And their averages, so they averaged pass per game was 35.8, which was 16th, and their rushing average per game was 25.7, which was 13th. So Aaron Rodgers finished as QB 8 in fantasy football. Aaron Jones was running back 2. Jamal Williams was running back 35. Devontae Adams was wide receiver 23. Alan Lazard was wide receiver 68. Jimmy Graham was tight end 21, and he is no longer on the team. So here we go. In 4 games Devontae Adams missed, Aaron Jones caught 5.5 passes per game. In 12 games Adams played, Jones caught just 2.25 passes per game. And 2 other big numbers that we need to know for Jones are 19 and 65%. So 19 represents his total touchdowns in 2019, and the number that was due to regress even before the Packers selected A.J. Dillon. 65% represents the snap threshold Jones only hit 4 times. Twice during games Jamal Adams missed, and 2 more times where he left early. The addition of A.J. Dillon is just one more data point in a long trend for the Packers limiting Jones from being a workhorse for fantasy football. So to go over their 2020 offseason draft picks, Jordan Love, A.J. Dillon, Josiah Dugara, tight end. Kamal Martin, which is a linebacker. John Runyan, offensive tackle. Jake Hansen was a center. Simon Stepanik, offensive tackle, Vernon Scott, safety, and Jonathan Garvin, defensive end. They added Devin Funchess, who is also not playing because he's opted out. They added Christian Kirksey, who's a linebacker, and offensive tackle Rick Wagner. Jimmy Graham left. Blake Martinez left, linebacker. Geronimo Allison left, wide receiver, who was there for a while. Tight end Richard Rogers left, and linebacker Kyler Frackwell left. So here are some rankings and projections for the 2020 Green Bay Packers. So Aaron Rodgers is looking like he is in a range of quarterback 12 to quarterback 15. Aaron Jones is looking like he's in a range from running back 13 to running back 16. A.J. Dillon is looking like running back 51 to 56. Devontae Adams, some people say he is wide receiver 2. Alan Lazard is wide receiver 46. The Packers defense and special teams is looking like they are ranging from 11 to 14. Some stat projections are looking like for Aaron Rodgers is under 4,000 yards, 28 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, 227 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, which is for the rushing, of course. And then Aaron Jones is predicted to get 8,200 rushing yards, 10 total touchdowns, 4 receptions for 372 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. A.J. Dillon is looking like 493 yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, 3 receptions for 24 yards, and 0 receiving touchdowns. Jamal Williams, 154 yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 33 receptions for 260 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Devontae Adams, 166 targets, 106 receptions, 1,285 yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns. And Alan Lazard, 107 targets, 72 receptions, 961 yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. So what did the Packers draft really mean? Green Bay selected the quarterback in the first round and a 247-pound back in the second, and no wide receivers at all. So Rodgers is safe for 2020, but Jones will have a hard time repeating his league-leading 19 touchdowns. Meanwhile, the targets that are there for Adams to have a monster year, plus Lazard to build on a solid end of 2019 if he can become the clear number 2 over free agent addition Devin Funchess, which of course we know he will not be playing this season. So if you're paying attention, what does that mean? His price is probably going to rise a bit. Lazard, pay attention. So they're going to have one sleeper, one breakout, and one bust potentially. And some people are predicting that A.J. Dillon will be the sleeper. So Dillon was a surprise second-round pick in 2020, and the fantasy community seems to have written him off a bit, in part because of the talent that the Packers already have at the running back position, and in part because the numbers of high-profile backs who went before him in. So both Jones and Williams are on contract years, so maybe Dillon was a long-term pick, but Dillon's speed and size combination closely mirrors Derrick Henry's as a player who's very much has the physicality and collegiate track record to handle the load at the next level, and the Packers were clearly enamored with him. Think of Dillon as a high-end handcuff in a good offense that wants to run the ball, but has the potential to stand-alone value with 8 to 10 carries per week to keep Jones fresh. And given the nearly 40 pounds that he has on Aaron Jones, Dillon is arguably the front runner for goal line work in an offense that generates 25 rushing back scores or running back scores in 2019. Breakout, of course, is probably easier than most to predict is Alan Lazard, and someone is going to need to step up into the second pass catching role. And even as Adams is expected to dominate the looks, that could be Lazard. And he worked his way into playing time in 2019 as it went on. And after not catching a pass in the season's first 5 weeks, Lazard closed the year with at least 3 catches on 8 of the final 11 games, notably drawing praise from Aaron Rodgers throughout. He's 6'3", 225 pounds. Lazard is a big outside receiver who was impressive 4-year producer at Iowa State. He broke out as a sophomore and posted 3 straight seasons and the dominator rankings north of 30%. And the biggest hurdle for the wide receiver is being an underrated college producer, which didn't generate much buzz and went undrafted in 2017. And he's trying to find his role in some playing time. And given that he's 24 years old and a solid shot of making a fantasy impact in the late round flyer in 2020. So keep an eye out for him. A bust, Aaron Jones. And let me just tell you, the Aaron Jones bust thing is real because it's not really about his talent. We understand Aaron Jones is a talented running back and a talented NFL player. But the bust thing is because of his ADP. We don't not like players. We don't like draft position. And Aaron Jones is an incredible talent who had a breakout 2019 and deserves all the credit in the world for his performance and abilities. But he's also a tricky fantasy selection in 2020 because of the Dillon pick and because just how much his performance will be tough to repeat based on how the Packers have used him. Jones only played over 65% of the snaps 4 times in 2019, and those coincided with absentees from Williams. 3 of Jones's 5 100-yard rushing performances and 7 of his 19 total touchdowns came in those 4 games. And now they've added Dillon, seamlessly furthering their presence or their preference for Jones to not be the bell cow every snap. His receiving production was also far better when Adams missed time. And for as much as it seems that Jones was unleashed in 2019, dig a little deeper. And it's clear that the Packers treated it more as a break glass in case of emergency situation. It's hard enough for backs to repeat anything close to Jones' 2019 season, particularly the 19 touchdowns, when their team wants to use them as a full-time players. It will be incredibly hard for Jones, given the Packers seem hell-bent on keeping him as a rotational role. So there you have it. That's kind of your Packers preview into 2020 if you haven't been paying attention to what they have going on, and that's what they have going on. I wouldn't pay too much far into their tight end situation because it seems a little bit bare, and at best you might find a tight end 19 in the Packers situation. And if you're in a deep league, maybe you need to get that, but if you are not in the so deep league, you should probably look elsewhere and invest in a tight end earlier on, so that way you're not stuck with the Packers tight end, because it looks like they have plenty enough options at the running back position in a run-heavy offense that they're leaning towards. They'll even have people aren't projecting Aaron Rodgers to get 4,000 yards passing, which is kind of insane. But also, it's pretty reasonable seeing the trend that is going. And it's not to say that Aaron Rodgers can't throw the football anymore, but it's more so a testament to what the Green Bay Packers offense is evolved into post Mike McCarthy for all those long times of seeing Aaron Rodgers basically carry the load his whole career. And his career basically parallels Drew Brees for me a lot, because they came around the same time as far as stardom and winning Super Bowls around the same time. And one won the MVP while the other one also had an MVP caliber season. And they both were carrying their teams offensively for so long, and now they're both on similar declines. Drew Brees, of course, way older, and also his decline is steady and quite recognizable, and Aaron Rodgers' decline is recognizable if you pay attention to the numbers, but also it doesn't feel like it's coming as steady as you may think. But decline it shall. Father Time waits for no football man. But we're going to take our final break and we're going to get into our AFC team of the day, which actually is going to be the Chargers. So get ready, LA Chargers, not San Diego. Here we come, GSMC.
Check Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, GSMC Fantasy Football Nation. We're back for our final segment of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for this Friday. I know, boo, boo, tears. Hopefully not violent exclamations or violent explicits coming my way. You know, we come back weekly here. I'll be back, but we have to finish up the podcast talking about our favorite AFC team that always seems to find a way to disappoint us. The LA Chargers, filled with talent and also filled with heartbreak. We all know about their current situation at quarterback. Phillip Rivers is no longer there. Running back, Melvin Gordon is no longer there. Here we go. Justin Herbert was landed in just about the perfect spot with placeholder quarterback and tons of weapons around him. He probably gives the Chargers offense more upside for 2020, and he's got enough weapons around him to make this a very soft landing. But in all likelihood, we'll see Tyrod Taylor, I should say, to start the season at least. And if and when the switch is made, will be something to watch. So, 2019 review. They were 5-11, not a good record. They averaged 21.1 points per game, which was 21st in the NFL. Yards per game, they were 10th, though, with 367 yards per game. They were 6th in passing yards. They were 28th in rushing yards with 90 rushing yards per game. They were 11th in pass attempts per game, which was 37.3, and they were 28th in rushing attempts per game, which was 22.9. So, we know the finishes. Phillip Rivers wasn't there, but he finished as quarterback 17. Austin Eckler was running back 4. Melvin Gordon was running back 22. He's not here anymore. Keenan Allen was wide receiver 6. Mike Williams was 39th. Hunter Henry was tight end 9. And that's your big name guys who finished out the season. So, in Tyrod Taylor's 3 seasons as a full-time starter for Buffalo, his 16-game pace was for 449 passing attempts. And that's at least in part due to Tyrod's both scrambling and at a high rate, and also taking sacks at a high rate. As a result, he was always near in the top of the league in percentage of dropbacks that didn't end in a pass attempt. In Phillip Rivers' past 3 seasons, his 16-game pace was 558 pass attempts. And as long as Tyrod Taylor is under center, the team will have far less passing volume to go around, and that has been in recent seasons. So even if Herbert takes over, he might throw a bit less than Rivers did. So here's the 2020 offseason for the LA Chargers. I'm getting so much better at not saying the San Diego Chargers, but I digress. They drafted Justin Herbert, of course. They drafted Kenneth Murray, another first rounder. He's a linebacker, though. They drafted Joshua Kelly, running back, needed another one. Joe Reed, wide receiver, in the 5th round. They drafted KJ Hill in the 7th round as a wide receiver. They also got Chris Harris Jr., a cornerback, in free agency. And they got Donald Farham in free agency as a tight end. And they got Trey Turner as a guard, Linval Joseph, defensive tackle, Nick Vigil in linebacker, and Brian Beluga, offensive tackle. Of course, we know who left: Phillip Rivers, Melvin Gordon, Russell Okung, Michael Schofield, and Travis Benjamin. So here are your projections on where they will be placed in drafts. Quarterback 19 for Tyrod Taylor, Justin Herbert. Some people don't really know, but some people are projecting 31. Austin Eckler is looking to be running back 6 through 9, respectively. Joshua Kelly is looking like around 50, 51, 57 to some. Justin Jackson, we don't really know for sure. Some people think that he's going to be 53. Keenan Allen is looking around wide receiver 16 to 22, which is a bit weird to me. And Mike Williams is looking like he's going to be around wide receiver 51 to 57. Hunter Henry is looking like he could be either tight end 6 to tight end 9. And their defense can range, but defense is kind of a toss-up. We don't really have to talk about it too much. And look at some projections. So Tyrod Taylor is looking like he might have under 4,000 yards. I know, big shocker. But 3,723 yards to be exact. 23 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 328 rushing yards, and 3 rushing TDs. Austin Eckler, 742 rushing yards, 4 touchdowns, 79 receptions, 788 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns. So that's a pretty balanced stat line for him. Justin Jackson, 447 yards rushing, 3 rushing TDs, 16 receptions for 100 yards, no touchdowns. Joshua Kelly, 505 yards rushing, 3 rushing TDs, 21 receptions for 144 yards. Keenan Allen is looking like 137 targets, 93 receptions for 1,000 yards barely, and 5 TDs. Mike Williams is looking at 88 targets for 50 receptions, 799, and 5 touchdowns. Hunter Henry is looking at 99 targets, 70 receptions, 800 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So the biggest question, how much does the passing game miss Phillip Rivers? So Phillip Rivers probably doesn't get the respect he deserves. But the fantasy finishes of his receiving options throughout his career speak volumes. Whether it's Taylor or Herbert starting in 2020, the Chargers are likely to throw less often, and those passes are likely to be lower quality than we're used to. Keenan Allen has averaged more than 100 catches over the past 3 years, and while Austin Eckler caught 92 balls last season, expect those numbers to drop and Mike Williams and Hunter Henry to lose some work as well. Because when you're dealing with lower quality quarterbacks, as far as the passing game is concerned, it is going to happen. And we don't know, maybe Justin Herbert comes out and throws barn burners, but it's unlikely, and we probably won't see him starting for a little bit of time. They probably aren't going to try and rush him, especially in the middle of a pandemic. We'll see. But we got some sleepers, we got a breakout, and we got some busts. So a sleeper might be Joshua Kelly. So whether it's Kelly or Justin Jackson, someone figures he'll be involved in the Chargers backfield in 2020 alongside Austin Eckler. And both of those running backs are being forgotten about in drafts coming off the board as late round picks. The choice here is that Kelly is simple. Justin Jackson is a former 7th-round pick who had some fantasy relevance in late 2018, only after both Gordon and Eckler missed time, but then was slightly used in early 2019 when Gordon held out, and then this offseason the team made the decision to select Kelly in the 4th round, and that you think Justin Jackson might be a better talent, but reading the tea leaves, the team decisions makes people lean towards Kelly. At any rate, the confusion about who might be the number 2 has kept both of them inexpensive, and yet it seems like likely one plays enough to crush their ADP, and one could be said about the quarterback room, and Tyrod Taylor is another early season sleeper likely to perform well above his ADP, whether or not he's on the field. Mike Williams might be the breakout guy. So truth be told, a lot of people are not high on many Chargers for the 2020 season, but there is one guy that we might need to pay attention to, and it would be Mike Williams, whose 2019 was quite irregular. So first of all, Williams's 18-yard average depth of target was 2.3 yards deeper than any other player with at least 75 targets, and that helped him rack up the 8th most air yards in the entire league and the yards per reception figure north of 20. And yet somehow this is where things got a little bit weird. So despite all the explosive plays, he scored just 2 touchdowns. In 2018, Williams scored 10 times on just 43 receptions, so we know that his size and downfield role can translate to house calls. If he maintains the downfield routes, he should continue to find chunk plays, especially with more mobile quarterback options, and the touchdowns that typically come with those chunk plays should bounce back in 2020. And the bust, which feels a little bit sacrilegious to me, as Austin Eckler has been nothing more than a win for me, and both times I've had him. Austin Eckler should be fine, but this isn't about players, this is about ADPs. We have to be worried about his receiving value. His 92 catches in 2019 are going to come down. Of course, it's only natural. And maybe it might come way down. So for starters, the Chargers are going to throw a lot less overall. And there's the fact that the mobile quarterbacks tend to throw their backs less frequently than immobile ones. And nobody threw to backs more than Phillip Rivers. Taylor has thrown to backs at a high rate before, but he never had anything close to the downfield weaponry in Buffalo that he has in Los Angeles currently. But even when LaShawn McCoy led the Bills in targets in 2017, that equated to just 59 carries or 59 catches. And we could see 60 catches for Austin Eckler, but 90 feels a little bit unreachable. And there's also his efficiency. So Austin Eckler had maybe the best receiving season for a running back ever. His 9.2 yards per target and 8 receiving touchdowns are both due for regression. And even if he's excellent again in 2020, while his rushing game yardage should rise and he might be able to add some rushing touchdowns, we're talking about a different statistical profile from the one that propelled Austin Eckler into a top 5 in PPR leagues last year. If everything goes right, he could return value or get close to it, but we can't be too sure that the ceiling to repeat what he did in 2019, it'll be a tough choice in the second round for sure. So that is your Chargers 2020 preview. And if it was me, I think that Keenan Allen is being talked about a little bit too less. And I know he's popped up in the news for ruffling the feathers of certain wide receivers on certain lists. But I think that he is one of the more standout wide receivers in our game. And he's a guy that has proven so far that he can get his, no matter the situation. Phillip Rivers was not a pretty picture last year for any stretch of the word. Now, granted, he threw the football. If there's one thing Phillip Rivers is going to do for any sort of offense at any time, is he's going to find a way to sling that football and sling the rock. And I'm sure Keenan Allen appreciated it, but I think Keenan Allen is a guy who can stabilize an offense and be a really, really good target for people's quarterbacks. The problem is Tyrod Taylor isn't the most accurate quarterback in the world, and sometimes he's not the best decision maker either. And Keenan Allen is a guy who is an excellent route runner, and he may be better with a guy who's better with timing routes and things like that. And Tyrod Taylor is not a timing routes guy. We don't know if Justin Herbert will be a timing routes guy. We'll only know when the time comes for either Justin Herbert to start, or maybe we won't ever even see Tyrod Taylor touch the field at all this upcoming season. But I feel like Keenan Allen has deserved the benefit of the doubt. And I don't think him being wide receiver 22, that's kind of low to me. But if you can get him at wide receiver 22, that's pretty cool. And now, granted, some guys are going way above, and this is like the whole Le'Veon Bell thing. There's guys going above Le'Veon Bell that just don't even make sense. Like, they're in a running back by committee situation, and Le'Veon Bell is going beneath them because he's all jet. But no one on any of those lists are going to have the same amount of opportunity as Le'Veon is to get Le'Veon's potential stats and what he can do. But I digress. That is your 2020 LA Chargers. And this is the end of the Fantasy Football Podcast for the GSMC. I'd like to thank you all for checking in and listening and sticking with us for this lovely conversation today. And I would encourage everyone to please go follow, rate, and review the podcast. Every click helps. Every review helps. Every star helps us get better and better here at the GSMC. Don't forget to follow our social media, our Facebook and our Twitter at GSMC Fantasy Football. I post gifts. We talk fantasy sports. We get it done over there. For the GSMC, this is Ethan, and I'll see you all next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.